This happened 5 years ago. I recently graduated and landed a new job in Reno. It wasn't anything fancy, just an administrative assistant position at a local shipping company. That office was the kind of place where people worked for years. But I was the only young woman in my department. To be honest, it didn't bother me at all. I was used to the occasional stares and offhand comments. Some of the guys would even come a little too close or ask me random questions that had nothing to do with work. It was annoying, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. Then about a month into the job, one afternoon I decided to go to the nearest cafe. I had a half-hour lunch break, and the cafe was only a couple of blocks away. I liked the walk after hours of nonstop grinding. It was a nice break from staring at my computer screen all day. I found the cafe after a few minutes of walking. I went inside and ordered a cold brew. I told my name to the guy at the counter and paid for the coffee. But while walking back toward my office, I accidentally stumbled into a guy and spilled the coffee on him. He was standing near the corner, leaning casually against the side of a building. I immediately apologized to him, but he only smiled and said it was nothing. He was handsome, different from the middle-aged perverts I encountered daily. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if he hadn't kept staring at me. At first it felt weird, but I didn't want to be rude after just spilling icy coffee on him, so I smiled back. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe this guy wasn't a weirdo. He kept staring and asked if we had met before. I told him no. He apologized and said I looked really familiar. I was disappointed. It was such an obvious line. There was no way I would have fallen for that. Then he introduced himself as Adam. He said he worked at a local restaurant and lived with his mom in an apartment a few blocks away. I was confused. Why the hell was he telling all this to me, a random stranger he had just met? But then he called me by my name and asked, "Where do you work?" "Samantha." I started panicking. I hadn't told him my name. It was all a setup and I couldn't figure out a way to get out of there. He asked if I worked around there. I tried to act casual and lied, saying I used to work at a nearby bar. I didn't know why I said that. Maybe because I didn't want to seem like I found it out by ignoring him completely. He kept staring at me as usual. Honestly, it was creeping me out. I told him I should probably get going, taking a small step back. Then he asked if I had a boyfriend. That was the moment the conversation took a turn. The moment that tiny feeling of unease grew. I lied and said yes. He asked for his name. I made one up and told him it was Jason. He looked frustrated and said Jason was such a lucky guy. But something about the way he said that made my stomach twist. I didn't react and just told him it was nice meeting him. But he cut me off and started asking for my number. I laughed like it was a joke, but he didn't laugh at all. I told him I didn't think my boyfriend would appreciate that and started walking away. He stood there silently. I was panicking, watching right and left, wondering if he would attack me, but he didn't. He just stood there. I walked as fast as I could. My heart was hammering harder than it should have been. At the office, I still couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I kept thinking about it that day, but a week passed and I didn't see him anywhere again. I got busy with work and thought to myself, maybe it was just an encounter with a creepy dude. At some point, I had completely forgotten about the conversation. But then, on Valentine's Day, exactly in the evening, when I got back to my apartment, I found a gift box in my driveway. I immediately got goosebumps. The box even had my name written on it. For a second, I just stood there, staring at it. I had no idea who it was from. Then I carried it inside, sat on my couch, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a small heart-shaped frame, and inside that frame was a picture of me. It wasn't a picture I had taken, nor had I posted it anywhere. It was a picture of me walking down the street. I was dead silent for a moment, but then I saw a red piece of paper glued behind the frame. It was a phone number. By that time, I had already guessed who it was. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed the number. The line rang twice before he picked up. His voice was calm, like he had been expecting my call. I snapped at him, telling him to leave me alone. He chuckled and said he was hoping I'd call. I raised my voice, yelling that I didn't know what kind of sick game he was playing, but I wasn't interested, and my boyfriend would be really mad at him. He was quiet for a moment, but then he told me he knew I didn't have a boyfriend. But he didn't mind that I had lied to him. I hung up as soon as I heard that, my hands trembling, and I almost dropped my phone. I barely slept that night. I double-checked the locks and kept all the lights on in my place, but it wasn't over. The next day, another box appeared, but this time, I didn't have the courage to open it. I didn't want to be part of any of his creepy games. I stared at it and threw it in the trash. That night, around midnight, I woke up hearing something hitting my window. Then I woke up and heard it again. It was constant, like someone was walking on the walls. I turned the lights on to see what was happening outside. I crept toward the curtains and peeked outside. I didn't see anything. It was dead silent. But when I went outside, I noticed the super freaky wet streaks on the glass. I swear it was the creepiest thing I had ever seen. The whole wall was painted red, and there were burst heart-shaped balloons everywhere. I knew he was somewhere, watching me with his creepy eyes. The mere idea disgusted me. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I grabbed my phone and called the cops. When I told them everything, they took it seriously. 3 days later, the cops called me to the station. When I went inside, I saw Adam locked behind bars. He was still smiling at me, but I didn't look back at him and walked straight past him. The officer said that Adam had a rare condition called erotomania, or something similar that leads people to obsess over someone. He informed me that people with this syndrome can go to any length to prove their point and always misinterpret what the other person is trying to tell them. I started crying in frustration at the police station. Without realizing, I had walked into serious danger. I had no idea people like him even existed in this world. I was aware of the dangers of being a woman, but I never thought I'd be a victim of stalking. My girlfriend Emily and I had been together for 3 years at that point. We had our fair share of ups and downs, but she stayed with me even at my worst. I've been busy at my office for a few weeks, and we didn't really get to go out except for the time when we went to her cousin's wedding last month. So my coworker Astor suggested that we go out on Valentine's Day. I wanted to make the night special for us, but between me and Emily, we never were the overly romantic type. One might say we are one of those boring types. I booked a reservation for both of us in a fancy restaurant. Now, I won't mention the name or anything, but it was one of the best restaurants in the area. I wanted a table with window seats, but most of the restaurants were already full due to the high demand. After searching for a while, I finally made a reservation. That night, I went to Emily's place to pick her up. My eyes widened when I saw how beautiful she looked in that red dress. I started the engine after I picked her up. We drove into the city, and the drive was smooth. Emily had her feet propped up on the dashboard, while a Savage Garden song was playing on the stereo. We pulled up to the restaurant a few minutes later. After stepping inside, we felt the place slightly warmer than the outside. It had soft lighting, and a hostess greeted us before leading us to our table. As we sat down, we could hear glasses clinking in the background and quiet conversations humming around us. It felt like a perfect night with everything going on there. Emily and I sat across from each other and placed our orders. The waitress said the food would take about 10 minutes to arrive. So in the meantime, we started talking about the new movie Paul Thomas was releasing. But then I noticed a man smiling at me from a few tables away. He had a woman beside him who seemed to be his wife. The man nodded at me, as if giving me a small acknowledgement. It seemed a little weird at first, but I nodded back so I wouldn't seem rude. I turned my attention back to Emily. She was talking about her dad's new pickup truck and how the stereo on it was better than her own car's, even though it was a cheaper truck. We laughed about how her dad was going to blow his ears out if he listened to music too loud. And just then, our food arrived, so we started eating, continuing our usual conversations. But then, the woman from the other table started approaching us. The man followed closely behind her. She smiled at Emily and told us that Emily reminded them of their daughter Candace, who lived in Missouri. Emily politely smiled back. I was getting a little annoyed because they were interrupting our moment. They introduced themselves, and the man said his name was Jack and the woman was Diana. Diana started talking about their relationship and asked us how long we had been together. But then Jack smiled at Emily and asked where we lived. I immediately felt uneasy. The question was too personal, too forward for small talk between strangers. I gave him a vague answer, saying we lived in a neighborhood on the other side of town. He held my gaze for a moment, as if he was processing the information. Meanwhile, Emily was oblivious to everything. She kept laughing and talking with Diana. I tried to hide the unease settling over me, so I kept the conversation going. The couple started oversharing about themselves, telling us about how they met each other, and some drama happened in their high school. But something felt off. Their story felt too perfect to be true. It sounded like they had told the same story to hundreds of people before. I still couldn't figure out why they were so interested in being friends with us. But when they went back to their table, I noticed something that gave me the chills. Jack was constantly looking behind me, repeatedly moving his head like he was nodding at someone. I tried to process what was happening, but he kept moving his head precisely in the same direction. I realized they were not alone in this. Something big was happening around us, and they were baiting us for it. My heart started pounding. I had an urge to look behind me to see who they were communicating with, but I knew if I did, they would find out I was on to them. So I forced myself to stay calm. Emily smiled at me, commenting on how good the food was. I smiled back and nodded, but I couldn't taste anything. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of the situation. I told Emily I needed to use the restroom and handed her my card so she could pay in the meantime. But I didn't actually go to the restroom. Luckily, the place had a corridor that led to both the kitchen and the restroom. I peeped through the holes in the corridor so I could watch them without being seen. And then I saw everything. There were 2 more people sitting behind our table. When Emily left to pay, the 4 of them started talking. I didn't hear what they were talking about, but I knew we were in grave danger. I pretended to come out, wiping my hands as if I had just washed them. As I walked back, I saw the other 2 whispering and glancing toward our table. I stayed calm and walked straight to Emily. I kept my voice casual and told her we were getting late. She looked confused and said we had just finished eating. I quickly made up an excuse about needing to get up early for work. She sighed but didn't argue. I took her hand and we headed toward the parking lot. As we reached the car, I heard movement behind us. A chill ran down my spine and I knew they had noticed we were leaving. My grip on Emily's hand tightened while she got even more confused. We quickened our pace and Emily was trying to keep up with her heels on. But just before we got inside the car, Jack and Diana caught up to us. Diana smiled and invited us to a very famous ice cream shop just a few blocks away. I forced a smile and politely said maybe some other time. But it was nice meeting them. At that moment, Jack stared at me. I realized he knew I was faking it. Without hesitation, I quickly got into the car. I started the engine, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. The 2 of them still stood there giving me a death stare. I started to get out of the parking lot as fast as I could. But as soon as I left the parking lot, I saw 2 more cars pulling out behind me. Emily looked at me, still confused. But without explaining, I floored the gas, looking at the rearview mirror. Normally, I'm a calm person, but at that moment, I was anything but calm. Emily started panicking, asking me for an explanation. While keeping an eye on the mirror, I briefly told her everything. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She gripped my hand tightly and started crying, saying it was all her fault. I tried to calm her down, but we weren't safe yet. The 2 cars were closing in. The road was mostly empty, making it easier for them to follow us. I remembered a shortcut a mile ahead leading to an old church. I knew it well because I used to go there with my mom as a kid. I had to act fast. I spotted the turn behind the old gas station and took a sharp right. As soon as we were hidden, I killed the engine and turned off the headlights. Emily held on to me, catching her breath. I held her tightly and assured her I wouldn't let anything happen to her. Seconds later, the cars sped past us, completely unaware of where we had gone. We stayed there for a long time, making sure they were gone. Once I was certain, I started the engine and drove straight to the police station. We told the cops everything, but they weren't convinced. They said they couldn't arrest people just because we felt something was off. I started yelling at them, but Emily stopped me at that moment. Frustrated, I asked them to at least come back to the restaurant with us. When we arrived, the restaurant was completely empty. The staff said they barely remembered the couples. After all, they served dozens of people that night. The cops took the registry and looked for Jack and Diana on it, but they didn't find anyone. The tables were registered on some random name which didn't have anything that matched our statements. 7 months later, Emily and I got married. It's been 10 years since that night, and we never saw Jack and Diana again.